Hello, everybody. My name is Tomáš Jungwirth Březovský, and I am an ERMA graduate of 2015, so quite a long time ago. And I'm happy to take the floor today with a short input or a lecture that will be covering the issue of climate justice. And I named it Disentangling Justice in the Midst of the Climate Crisis. Just a few words about me. I have been working in climate for the past 5 years. I am leading a climate team at a Prague-based think tank called Association for International Affairs. I've been collaborating with the Czech Environment Ministry during the Czech EU Council presidency, and I have some other roles that are related to climate agendas or the low carbon transition, especially in the field of energy. Now, this lecture, I believe, is a first in a series that's being produced by the ERMA team. And I know that they're focusing on climate justice and the rights of future generations. So I hope we will be touching upon those rights as well during this conversation. But for me, really, the aim here is to try and help you navigate where does justice come in the conversation on the low carbon transition and on long-term sustainability. And let's get into it without further ado. And I would like you first to have a look at this picture. Now, it might seem familiar to many of you, but at the same time, I think it is eerily unfamiliar. It is the planet that we inhabit. Of course, it's the planet Earth. It is taken from a perspective or a point of view that's not very common and prominent, from the North Pole, actually. And one thing that should strike you immediately, except for maybe that there are no clouds, because it's not a picture, but rather an image, is that the ice sheets have melted. And this has led to an increase in the global ocean surface by several tens meters, perhaps 50 meters. And as a result, this has flooded vast amounts of land, including in what we would see as Northern Europe currently, also Florida, etc. And of course, this was done as a perhaps an imaginative exercise by, I believe, National Geographic some years ago. But increasingly, it's becoming something to grapple with in reality, because this can very well be our future as a civilization, and we should be, I think, well aware of what we are doing by pumping such great amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this leads me immediately to this set of graphs that I like to present during my talks and presentations, that I think is serving to kind of set a baseline where we are as a civilization. So on the upper left side, you can find a graph that shows you the development of the world's human population in the past 12,000 years. And of course, you can see that the massive spike and increase in the number of inhabitants has only been happening in the past couple hundred years. Now, in the upper middle graph, you can see the world GDP per capita, so economic output per capita in the past 500 years. And again, you can see that the graph is rising exponentially. And if you would like to see the global economic throughput, then you have to take those two graphs and actually multiply them together, which makes it even more striking, I believe. And we know that the prosperity and economic development as we know it, but also the increase of the number of people that are in the world currently has been very much linked to the availability of vast amounts of cheap energy. And so that's the third graph on the upper right side that shows you that the global primary energy consumption in the past 200 years have been on the rise steadily, especially due to the availability and exploitation of fossil fuels. So that would be coal, natural gas, and oil as primary sources. And we also know, and now that brings me to the lower left graph, that the utilization of such amounts of energy has actually had some implications in terms of CO2 emissions, right? So these two graphs are very much copying each other. On one hand, energy use, and on the other hand, the emissions of greenhouse gases. And you can see that also the cumulative CO2 emissions by world region have been on the rise with an exponential curve. And that is something that we need to take a very good note of. And I am not here today to lecture about the physics of climate change, but let's just state that the current reconstructed temperature as we see it on different graphs and models is being clear in one thing, and that is that we are in new territory in terms of the global warming that we are causing due to those greenhouse gases in such a very short time, in a couple decades or hundreds of years. And it's really becoming unprecedented. Actually, the extremes that we're seeing in global temperature in the atmosphere, but also in the oceans right now, are beyond anything that was recorded during human history. And so this is really our civilizational predicament, but let's not forget it's not only about climate change as such, but it's also about other environmental costs and damages that we are causing by land grabbing, etc. And that is also linked to, of course, the loss of biodiversity and the sixth great extinction of world species. So all of this is happening at the same time as we speak. And I think it's a very difficult and dire picture to look at, but at the same time, it's a very important one, because this is something that we need to get real with, and that we need to actually figure out if we want to sort out the crisis. Now, let's have a look at emissions. Emissions, as we said, greenhouse gas emissions, they are very much directly linked to the depth of the climate crisis. And we can have a look at them from different viewpoints now, but ours, I think, will be very much about who is then responsible. And this map that is trying to somehow copy or mimic the world map, but as you can see is massively distorted, is actually a map of what we call cumulative emissions. And so those countries are as big as they should be according to how many emissions of greenhouse gases they have emitted throughout the history of especially the past 200 years. And I'll just let you have a look at this graph and this map and scout it for a little bit. Because I think it's striking that the countries of the global north, especially the United States of America, but also many European countries, including the one that I come from in Prague, Czech Republic, they are actually massively big on this map. And Czechia is even bigger than probably all of the African countries, much more populous ones, perhaps with the exception of South Africa, but also most of the Latin American countries, again, much more populous than ours. And if we want to talk about who has the responsibility for actually causing and perhaps then also resolving and tackling the climate crisis and helping others do that, then we should have this map in mind, because this is where especially the countries of global south coming to all those climate negotiations with some requests and expectations towards the global north, this is what they point to. They say, well, it's you who caused the crisis, and now it's us who are the primary bearers of the consequences. Now, another perspective, of course, is, well, let's not look at countries, states, let's look at wealth. So let's look at income groups, right? And this is from a report by Oxfam in earlier this year, I believe. And it is actually quite striking that the share of global population by income shows us that the richest 10% of the people in the world are responsible for at least a half of the global emissions. So this gives you this so-called champagne glass graph that is actually going to explain that, well, you know, it's not really about the sheer numbers of people and emissions being linked to people's numbers and quantities, but it's really about their lifestyles. And if people are rich and wealthy, they usually live very abundant lifestyles with a lot of energy consumption and with a lot of travel and overconsumption on many fronts. And this, again, leads to a lot of emissions. And the poorest 50% of the world at the same time are responsible for only about 8% of the overall emissions. And again, you can see that the disparity is quite clear and becoming more and more pronounced in the higher ranks of this graph. Now, this is where we stand in terms of emissions, but let's look at this. I think if we want to have an honest conversation on climate justice, then we also need to understand the expected impacts of climate change. And I have been already talking about the fact that it's the countries of the global south that are and are going to be impacted most severely. And this, I think, this map or this GIF is something that shows you that quite clearly. So you can see in different warming scenarios from 1.5 degrees centigrade to all the way up to 4.4 degrees, there's an increasing amount of the land that is simply becoming uninhabitable because the conditions will not be there for human survival. Just because it will be too hot or too warm or too wet and hot for people to actually live and flourish. And maybe they will be able to live in some air-conditioned houses and, you know, perhaps find some ways to survive in certain areas and with the use of certain technologies. But you can see that many of those places are actually where currently hundreds of millions or billions of people are living. And with the higher warming scenarios, many of those places will just become uninhabitable. And those people will need another place to move to and to live and to prosper. And so this brings me again to the question of, well, what has to be done? And I think we all know by now that what has to be done is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, starting with CO2. And we have global commitments, including the Paris Agreement, that tell you, well, we do not know exactly how we're distributing the burden, but what we do know is that we should try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at least up to 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial era. And to do that, we need to decarbonize, right? So to decarbonize, that means bringing the greenhouse gas emissions down as soon as possible. And many countries, including, well, the European Union, have actually set themselves the goals of climate neutrality, right? So here, what we can see at this graph, that's just a demonstration. It's a scenario that me and my colleagues have been working on with relation to the Czech Republic, prospecting and projecting a possible trajectory to decarbonize up to the so-called net zero or climate neutrality by 2050 by just applying a lot of technological, behavioral, social, and economic levers. But I'm not going to talk about this graph very much. It's just to demonstrate that we apparently, from all that the science tells us, need to change the ways work very quickly. And we need to do that all across the world so that we are in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and so that we are actually leaving a higher part and portion of the globe habitable for future generations. And this brings me to, I think, the fundamental part of this discussion, and that is climate is a political issue. Of course, it is a scientific fact. It is also related to a lot of economic and technological presumptions and implications, but it is not about pure natural science. Climate is a political issue. Why? Because, first of all, climate change impacts people in an unequal way. So people in different parts of the world and in different parts of the societies are going to be impacted differently. But also the transition itself, the transition away from fossil fuels and towards a low carbon economy impacts people in a different way. And people are mobilized. That's what makes it political. It's about the mobilization of large amounts of societies in favor of ambitious climate policies, or now perhaps more recently also against it for this reason or another. And what makes it political then is the potential to actually rekindle and reshuffle the current structures of power, and especially current structures of wealth and its distribution. And if we understand that climate is a political issue, then I think we can finally talk about justice. And here I like to show this little graph that I created. And I try to demonstrate that climate change has justice elements in a number of aspects that can be viewed from different standpoints. And if we want to talk about climate justice, so then first of all, we will probably have in mind the justice between the rich and wealthy people, and then among those who are not so rich, who are poor, impoverished, have lower incomes, properties, etc. That's usually what we mean by justice. But it has other implications as well, right? So the second arrow actually goes to show you that it's about justice between and among some of the most developed countries of the world and some of the least developed, or some of the countries of the global north and some of the countries of the global south. And this actually requires us to get to terms with our colonial history as well, and the sourcing of resources in large scales that has been happening for many, many centuries under the leadership of certain global north countries, in countries of Africa, Latin America, Asia, etc. So justice then is also about justice from the rich, wealthy countries, which have been very much basing their prosperity on the utilization of resources of other less wealthy countries. Now, the third element or dimension to it is intergenerational justice. And I think this is something that is of a lot of interest here, because if we want to talk about the rights of future generations, well, then that is intergenerational justice. And that is also why Greta and the other young students have been protesting and saying, well, you guys, you adult people, you are selling out our future, and you're giving our future lives at stake by not doing enough on climate change. And so it's about justice, not only among the people who are maybe older now and those who are in their 20s or 30s currently, but it's also about the justice of future generations who may have not even been born yet. And I think that's quite key here. And in economic terms, this translates into something that's called the discounting rate. And it relates to the question of how much do we value the present good and present benefit as compared to a future good and future benefit. And we need to put a lot of value on the future benefit if we want to actually get to a good incentive for decarbonizing very fast now. Now, the fourth element that I see it here, or first dimension, is justice among genders. And we know that climate change in different parts of the world has very strong negative consequences, especially for women. And that can be because they are responsible for instance, securing water supply to the families and households in places where water resources run dry. But it also can be just because women generally tend to live longer lives, and all the women are the ones who are actually most affected by heat waves, as we know from scientific evidence. So there's also a gender dimension to the conversation. Now, last but not least, I think it's about zooming out from this very anthropocentric perspective that we are often employing and that we are often feeling and feeding into the conversation when we think and talk about meeting the needs of some people here and there, born or unborn. But we also should have in mind that there are other parts of the life nature that perhaps ought to be protected and done justice to. And I think we're not bringing that into the conversation quite enough, because it's about ecosystems, it's about different species, it's about the nature as such, which might have some intrinsic value. So it's not only about fulfilling people's needs, and policies should not only be always about fulfilling people's needs, but they should be also about protecting something inherent about the beauty of nature and natural diversity. So this is kind of my introduction to where I think we can demonstrate the justice element in the conversation around climate. Now, it translates into a lot of different slogans, into a lot of different terms. So you will hear around a lot of climate justice, some solidarity, then quite a bit on just transition, which oftentimes pertains particularly to the past coal regions that are now finding a new economic purpose. You will hear about fair and just transition, which is an extended term that is now currently being thrown around. You will hear about environmental justice, which perhaps is a bit broader even than climate justice. You will hear this imperative, leave no one behind. That's something that's very strongly also in the talks of, for instance, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, but also something that is prominent in different EU documents. So it's about not leaving anybody behind in the process of the transition. And I think it's a very ambitious goal, because probably some people are going to be left behind eventually. But it's definitely a reasonable moral and ethical imperative. And then last but not least, we have equity. And equity is, again, something that Greta Thunberg has been stressing quite a lot. And equity in the current political and legal framework relates to the fact that the countries, especially of the global south, are requiring that they can burn through some amounts of fossil fuels and emit some amounts of greenhouse gases in the context of trying to bring prosperity to their communities. And the equity element is related to that, to the fact that us in the global north have already cumulatively emitted huge amounts of greenhouse gases while building our prosperity. And so we should be the ones who are leading the way in decarbonization. Now, what we know and what is becoming more and more apparent right now in the current conversations is that it's not going to be easy if we want to try and make the transition happen. And one of the elements that comes to this is that there are some people who are probably going to be left behind. And perhaps if the policies are not drafted in a way that's very inclusive, and if there are perhaps no alternatives for the people to go to, then there's going to be protests. And these that you can see on this picture, I mean, this is the protest of the Gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests in France a couple of years ago. And it's a protest that was triggered by essentially a pro-environmental and climate measure, the increase of tax on petrol. And those people have mobilized based on their perception that this is essentially unfair, because those were mostly people from the rural areas who have not had alternatives to actually using their automobiles and cars to commute and travel around their houses and around their villages, just because the public transport has not been in a state that would allow for this. And in the end, it's mobilized into a nationwide movement that inspired many and also sent the shivers down the spines of many politicians in Europe and beyond. And we can see another example of just that, I think, with the current agricultural and farmers' protests, right? So those farmers, again, to a degree, I mean, they complain and protest against a number of measures and elements in the policies, but they also mobilize to a part against the green and environmental and climate regulation because they feel it's being done unfair or in an unfair way or unfairly to them. And I am not going to discuss here whether they are right or not, because I think the contexts differ very much country from country, and there might be a grain of truth in many of their demands, but in other cases, they are also probably extending to other political forces that are hijacking those protests. So perhaps that's something for another conversation. But just to keep in mind that this element of doing the transition well and in a socially just way is fundamental for it to succeed. Otherwise, you're going to end up with strong anti-systemic movements. And this brings me almost to a close of this little talk and input. And here, what I would like to conclude on is a quote by Richard Rorty, a political philosopher, from his essay, Justice as a Larger Loyalty. That's been part of my ERMA syllabus 10 years ago, and it stayed with me since then. And in this essay that has nothing to do with climate, essentially, he goes on to elaborate why justice can be perceived as a larger loyalty. And what he says is that sharing food with impoverished people down the street is natural and right in normal times, but perhaps not anymore in a famine, when doing so amounts to disloyalty to one's family. And the tougher things get, the more ties of loyalty to those near at hand tighten, and the more those to everyone else slacken. And so he asks, should we contract the circle for the sake of loyalty or expand it for the sake of justice? And I think this is very much applicable to the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is and can be especially such a trigger of natural disasters and crop failures and extreme weather events that can lead to famine and can lead to extreme events and can lead to wars, etc. And so if we want to aspire for climate justice, I think the point that we should actually take home from this is that we really need to identify and understand and emphasize with the needs and desires of many, many people around the world, and try to expand the circle of the people that we feel responsible for and that we feel connected to, so that we can aspire for justice rather than just loyalty to those who are very close to us. And so with that, let me close this little session. Unfortunately, I will not be able to respond to any questions directly, but feel free to get in touch via email. You can find it on the screen here, and I'll be happy to discuss this topic further, and of course to follow the lectures that will be ensuing after this one. So thank you very much, and have a good day.